Welcome back to this virtual forum at the beginning of London Climate Action Week. We're going to be now talking about, can the UK's net zero target become a pathway for a green economic recovery? We have three of our four guests already with us. So what I'd like to do, if I may, ask each of you, as I introduce you, to just give me a kind of 30-second summary of your view of not just can the UK's net zero target become a pathway for a green economic recovery, but will the UK's net zero target become a pathway for a green economic recovery? And it's worth bearing in mind, obviously, what the Prime Minister said yesterday, which we've already briefly discussed right at the beginning with Nick Mabey, who's organising London Climate Action Week. Let me first, if I can, go to Lord Adair Turner, who's chair of the Energy Transition Commission. Adair, what's your view? Yes or no?
I think it can be a vehicle of a green recovery. There are specific things that we can do, both shorter term and medium term, which will both help the recovery from the crisis and will speed our transition towards net zero. What are those? They are very, very big investments in renewable electricity, in particular in North Sea offshore wind, taking advantage of the very, very low interest rates, cost of capital at the moment. And they are a strong program to retrofit and improve the energy efficiency of our building stock, improving energy efficiency, but in a way that creates lots and lots of jobs throughout all regions of the UK, which is exactly what we're going to need as we come out of this crisis. Now, there are some other features as well of policy, which we can come back to, but I probably exceeded my 30 seconds, so that's my first take on it.
Thank you, Adair. Let me go to Rain Newton-Smith, who's the Chief Economist of the Confederation of British Industry. Rain, your 30 seconds. Both can and will the UK's net zero target become a pathway for a green economic recovery? Because we're already hearing a bit of disappointment after yesterday's announcements from the British Prime Minister.
I absolutely do think the answer is yes. And not only can it, but I think it absolutely must. I think when you talk to businesses, this is a huge priority. It was only just over a year ago where we had the business community coming together with NGOs to get behind the UK Committee on Climate Change advice that we really needed to adopt a net zero target. And I think all businesses that I'm speaking to is really interested about the contribution they can make towards making this recovery absolutely part of our low carbon transition. And whether that's thinking about how we heat our homes and making sure that we retrofit them and we heat them from renewable energy sources, to how we move around the country and thinking about how we help the move to electric vehicles and other low emission vehicles, or thinking about how the UK can develop some of the world leading technologies in the same way we've done for offshore wind around carbon capture, usage and storage. I think with us hosting the climate change negotiations next year, it's a huge opportunity for the UK to really lead the world. And I think business is absolutely behind this, even though it's hugely challenging times for all of us. But if anything, the last few months has shown us is how we can change our behavior when we all work together to tackle a health crisis. It's now the time to tackle the climate crisis.
All right. Well, of course, opportunity is right. And I'd like to ask all of you eventually about whether the opportunity could be squandered or not realised. Let me go now to Emma Howard-Boyd, who's chair of the Environment Agency. Emma, you were going to join us this afternoon. You got called into a meeting, so you're joining us this morning, not talking specifically about investment. But given that yesterday there was obviously an announcement about a relaxation of planning process and so on, you're under enormous pressure in the Environment Agency just on resources alone. What's your reaction as to whether this really is achievable, whether certainly this government is committed in the way that you would like at the Environment Agency?
Well, thank you. I think the commitments to net zero are absolutely essential. I was at an event on Monday hosted by the Council for Sustainable Business, which was set up by Michael Gove when he was Environment Secretary. We had senior representation, I'm talking chief execs, of a huge number of FTSE businesses and chairs, cross-government representation, with a real momentum around commitments to net zero. But I think we also need to remember nature restoration, and preparing for climate shocks. And those two aspects have come very much to the fore throughout the coronavirus pandemic. The understanding of the importance and value of nature and green spaces, but the need for us all to be prepared for the climate emergency. And by that I'm talking about the issues that the Environment Agency deals with: too much water, too little water. And I was very encouraged back in the budget in March, where funding for flooding increased to 5.2 billion. I think we need to work together to make sure that as we build, it is building back better and building greener. And that is where we need to work together to make sure that those, the importance of the environment, as set out in the 25-year environment plan, as set out in the legislation that is going through Parliament at the moment, is really delivered on, not just by government, not just by arm's length bodies like the Environment Agency, but in partnership with business and investors who absolutely see the importance of net zero, the race to net zero, but the race to resilience as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Let me now, he's on the phone, Professor John Loughead, who's Chief Scientist at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, known as BASE in this country. John, I don't think you were able to hear everything, but I'm just asking for 30 seconds from each of you on the main question. How will the UK's net zero target become a pathway for green economic recovery? Are we on that pathway? Are we moving at the speed that is necessary at the moment?
Thank you very much. So I think that the recovery will be intimately connected with the net zero ambitions, because there is clearly an appetite to develop a green recovery from the current situation. And I think we do so from quite a good base on the achievements so far, but we should not underestimate the challenge of moving towards net zero. This will be much more difficult than the work that we've done so far. And I think that, as well as the range of technologies that we're going to need to introduce to achieve that, we should not forget that it will also require engagements with society at large in order to be able to deliver some of the changes that will be necessary. And I think that clearly government has a role to play in setting the direction and the schemes to support it, but equally, I think we shall need to significantly increase the active engagement of the population.
Thanks, John. We'll come back to you shortly. Let's now try and expand on everything that you've been saying. But Adair, can I come to you first of all? I mean, you're outside government. There we heard from John, an appetite, but this is a big challenge. And given where you are as chair of the Energy Transitions Commission and the way you have watched and been involved in government operating over many years, do you feel confident that actually there really is a commitment beyond rhetoric and even a legal commitment in the United Kingdom?
Well, look, clearly we have the legal commitment to net zero by 2050. And I think we have a very strong rhetorical commitment as well from this government, a strong focus on the COP26, which is the negotiations next year, being a real flagship of Britain's engagement in the world. And I know that that message has gone out clearly to our embassies across the world, that this is an important focus, and an important focus in the UK. I think the challenge is that the devil is in the detail. And I think what people are looking for now, in addition to what came out yesterday, was the detail of how green this building investment is going to be. Let's be clear what this means. It means that if we build new schools or new buildings within schools, they have got to be built to really high standards of energy efficiency. Because if we don't do that, we are either going to make it impossible to get to net zero eventually, because in our buildings, in our housing stock, in our hospitals, we'll have a whole load of energy inefficient buildings, or it will just be much more expensive to get there at a later date. Whenever you are building, you've absolutely got to get it right first time. So what we need now is an absolutely clear set of criteria for everything which is in this infrastructure building problem. How is it going to be greened? How is it going to be future-proofed to make sure that in 15 years' time, we're not looking and saying, oh, for God's sake, we built these bloody things in 2021 and 2022, and we built them in a bad fashion.
But is there a possibility of double speak here, the UK being the chair with Italy of COP26 next year and almost squandering the extra year? I mean, you understand how politics works in this country. There's a government with a majority of 80 saying we're going to relax planning regulations, throwing a lot of money around, which the Labour Party says is not new money anyway. Do you fear that rhetoric is going to try and cover up an inability really to deliver and actually act as a symbol and a lead beacon for other countries to follow?
Well, look, of course that is a danger. Obviously, things can go wrong in implementation, but I do believe that the government overall is committed to this agenda of net zero. It has this very strong institution, the Climate Change Committee, whose job is to point out if there are any disconnects between what the rhetoric says and what the reality says. And I think there will be, if we do see that disconnect, there will be a lot of challenge. So on the whole, I think we are in a position where, provided all the different people who are part of this debate are focusing on what has to happen, and when we get the details of these infrastructure programs saying, you know, where are the green criteria in this? What are the energy efficiency standards? Then we can turn this into a green building program. So it's all in the detail. It's all a matter of making sure that it is as green as it could be.
Well, let's go to the organisation which you were once a Director General of, the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry, Ray Newton-Smith. Can you be clear about all your members, without question, want to do this, want this to be the direction of travel? In other words, there's profit from greening.
Absolutely, and I think you know, we've seen that in a way we've been able to, you know, to create. Look at how we've been able to reduce our energy needs to where over half of our energy needs come from renewable energy. The offshore wind, onshore wind, these have been huge growth industries for the UK, and we can see that in development of, you know, and it's actually a lot of our energy members who are pushing the development of carbon capture, usage and storage. So that's where, you know, mechanisms we have to take carbon out of the air, to store it, and in some cases to use that as forms of energy. I think it is an area partly because of our geography where the UK can lead the world. So there's a huge amount of appetite. And I think building on the conversation you were having with Adair, I think when we think about the Prime Minister's announcements yesterday, I think what we would like to see them go further is just having more specifics about how this building will be green building. If we're talking about our schools, as Adair was saying, they absolutely, you know, if you're rebuilding a new school, it should be heated by a renewable energy source. And we also need to look about energy efficiency. You know, how are our buildings using energy efficiently, both in our homes, in our businesses? There's a real opportunity for that to happen, but that takes good regulation. It takes long-term planning, and then businesses can get behind with the investment that is needed.
Ray, thank you. Let me tell you, we've got several questions already coming in, and we've got 20 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is let the questioners drive. We've got 2,500 people out there watching this. Let me go to you, Emma, next, because your focus is on investment. That's where much of your career has been. This from Paul Massaro, who's board director and board advisor from the Committee on Fuel Poverty. With such widespread consensus around investments in energy efficiency, why is the government so reluctant?
Again, that's such a question with a lot of depth in it. I think it comes back to how we all need to work in collaboration. And if you think of one of the programs of work that the Green Finance Institute has kicked off, it's all around energy efficiency and working through with a group of investors and providers how this can be unlocked. So I go back to what Adair has said, the devil will be in the detail. There is far greater cross-government working now. Sitting where I do as a chair of a delivery body within the Department of Environment, how the department, how DEFRA engages with other departments on these issues where we need systemic change has changed dramatically over recent months, since the government made a commitment to net zero, since it took the presidency for COP26. And I just see the way that the policymakers are looking at the join up of across different sectors in a very, very different place than where we have been in the past. And then the signals that we are seeing from the investment community are very, very strong. We need to make sure that whilst we are preparing for this net zero investment, that we are also making sure that we are preparing for the climate shocks that are already embedded in the system, which is why I applaud the report that came out of the Committee on Climate Change last week. It set out department by department the issues that need to be taken on board in order to meet net zero, but it also looked at the need to prepare for adaptation and resilience. It looked at where the joint issues are, and we need to make sure that when we're investing in energy efficiency, that we are also preparing for overheating, for flooding, because what is the point of investing in energy efficiency if it washes away in a flood or melts in a heat wave? We have to join all of these issues up.
Thank you. Let me go to John Loughead. John, you are a public servant, and therefore, obviously, you are serving the government of the day and the ministers you work for. But let me just pick up on that point from Paul Massara. The question, why does the government appear so reluctant? Is that the way it seems and feels for you in base, the ministry?
I think it is a little unfair to say that there is reluctance in this. I think one of the big challenges in this area is the sheer complexity of this fundamental infrastructure that we're trying to change. And if I give some example about that, Adair was talking about the need for new buildings to high standards, and I totally agree with that. But we need to remember we've also got something in the region of almost 30 million existing dwellings, most of which will still be here in 2050. So there's also a massive challenge of refurbishment. And Emma has just talked about the need to link up in different areas, because we've got the electricity system, we've got the energy system used in the domestic sector, in the commercial sector, the industrial sector, there's transport. All of these are inextricably connected to each other. So it's very important that moves are taken that don't have inadvertent, unplanned consequences from them. Energy efficiency is clearly very important, but when we start looking at moves to improve the different parts of the system, then finding the right action in the right priority is quite challenging. And as you know, the PM has set up a new committee to focus on tackling climate change, which looks specifically at how the actions can best be coordinated and suitably prioritised so that we hit the target we've got.
Thank you, John. Again, a lot of questions coming in, and please keep the questions coming, because they are very specific and very helpful to focusing on critical issues as you see them out there. Let me bring together two questions, and particularly for you, Adair, given your position on the Energy Transitions Commission. This from Alessandra Meraviglia, who's Treasury IPV at NatWest Bank. Shouldn't the UK government ramp up carbon taxing on heating gas and subsidise low carbon energy systems for heating, fund R&D, promoting the concept of pumps and hydro? And I'd like to bring in as well another question from Norman Hynam, from the cold chain consultant, Hynam Assist, on the cold chain. We are missing areas of emission reduction by not working together with all sectors. What plan could make a joined up green plan for all areas, not just the trendy ones? In other words, there's in both those questions, there's a kind of skepticism that many of the opportunities are not being fully realised at the moment. Firstly, Adair.
Well, there's so many questions in there, but let's go to the one which was right up front there. which is should we produce a carbon tax on the use of gas for residential heating? The answer is yes. The future green economy has to be a deeply electrified economy, and that will give huge benefits in terms of local pollution as well as dealing with climate change, etc. Right today, we have effectively carbon taxes and other forms of support for the future green economy, increasing the price of electricity, but not increasing the price of gas. So electricity has much more charges piled onto it than gas. We have an asymmetry between those two, and we should bring that back into balance. And there are proposals being put forward, for instance, just yesterday by a thing called the Zero C Commission, Zero Carbon Commission, for a coherent approach to carbon pricing that the UK could apply once it is outside the European Union, which it would include as one element of it, imposing a carbon tax on the use of gas in residential heating. Now, what will be really important is that we combine that with subsidies for lower income houses, because heating is a significant part of people's budget, and with very strong support for lower income houses in particular to make the expenditure on energy efficiency, which can cut their energy bills, and for instance, the installation of heat pumps, electric heat pumps, which in the locations where you can put them in are very efficient forms of heating. So yes, we do need a clear plan for decarbonising residential heat, and yes, that will need to include, among many other factors, increasing the tax on gas to bring it into a better balance with the way that we are already treating electricity.
Thanks, Adair. Let me pick up with Rain, particularly that one part of the second question from Norman Hynam. We're missing areas of emission reduction by not working together with all sectors. Is that how you're seeing it at the CBI?
I think it's true that we've always said what we need to see is clear roadmaps across different industries and different sectors. And I think businesses really do want to work with the government on delivering this. So I think we do need to have clearer roadmaps across different industries, and that's something that we've absolutely been calling for. And I think as well, just to sort of build on what Adair was saying, I think what we also need to see is, we'd like to see a proper investment bank that help to get the funding mechanisms we need to see delivering some of these things. So if you think about homes, we know we've got 26 million, if not more, homes heated by gas boilers. We need to move them onto a renewable form of energy. But as a homeowner, often it's just too expensive for homeowners to necessarily pay the initial capital upfront cost to move to a new system. So we need to have a mechanism to help to help individual householders deal with the upfront costs, so they can move to those renewable forms of energy. And that could be delivered by an investment bank working with providers, as we saw with solar panels. Now we see solar panels in many places. That was partly because of the feed-in tariff. So if you design the policies well, you have the right financing mechanisms, you can get the investment needed by the private sector. But there's also a huge role the government can play in terms of social housing and really leading from the front by helping to retrofit a lot of our social housing onto more renewable forms of energy. And I think the final piece is about the skills. We're going to be in a period of higher unemployment, and how we make sure that we are building jobs in the right sectors and helping our heat engineers learn about some of these low source heat pumps. That's where we need to see the investment in training, so we can get our younger people trained up in these newer technologies, so they can help with this mass program of retrofitting that needs to happen.
Emma, I'll come to you in a moment, if I may, because what I'd like to do is just pick up with John. You are Chief Scientist at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, which suggests a good form of unity and also moving together in the same direction on critical issues. But I pick up again what Norman said. We're missing areas of emission reduction by not working together with all sectors. We need a plan to make a joined up green plan for all areas, not just the trendy ones. Do you concede that that is at least a perception that there is out there?
It's quite clearly important. You've got to have a plan that looks at the entire system, and that's something that is currently being developed, ready for an announcement later this year, which is essentially the response to the original net zero report from the Committee on Climate Change. So yes, it does require all those elements to go together, and it goes back to my earlier comment that this is a highly complex problem, and I'd just like to give one very quick example of that, in that Rain was just talking about the skills issue for different kinds of heating. And when you look at these new forms of heating, rather than just selecting a boiler with the right outputs, you've got to look at the complete system of a house to be able to work out how effectively to install some of these systems. And that is a skill base that I think definitely needs developing, because it's very difficult at the moment to find anyone equipped to do that.
All right, and I'm going to give you notice, three of you anyway, about my final question in about 3 minutes, which is what would you like to see the government do urgently? How to increase the urgency? Obviously, John, in government, you'll say that you're doing it well anyway. But I'd like to pick up, before I come to that, to Emma. This question from Gillian Gibson, it picks up on what Adair and Rain have already talked about, but it's specifically for planning. Gillian Gibson, who's an environmental consultant, how can we reach net zero when the UK government get rid of planning regulations which demanded net zero buildings from 2016? Can we hold the government to their commitments and to their rhetoric? And I focused it on you at the Environment Agency because you're short of resources, you're short of manpower, and every planning application, one way or the other, comes to the Environment Agency for consultation. You're overwhelmed at the moment, so is this going to be even more difficult for you?
Sorry, again, there's a lot in that question, and I specifically wanted to talk about collaboration and leadership and getting on with the race to net zero. And that's something that the Environment Agency has done by committing to net zero by 2030 ourselves. When it comes to planning, we are a statutory consultee around flooding. And we know that whilst we do give feedback on planning in relation to flooding, we also need to make sure that once consent has been given, that advice is followed through by whatever is being built. Partnership, leadership and collaboration, absolutely key in this next phase to make it a decade of difference and a decade of delivery. And again, I am encouraged by the join up that is taking place by the different departments, the conversations that are taking place again at that level to make sure we're joining up some of the policy requirements. We do need to make sure that we're working as efficiently as possible, and technology can really help when it comes to planning as well, and seeing how planning is and the commitments are actually delivered by those building the infrastructure or the properties. But I'm also encouraged how government is listening to business. Going back to the Council for Sustainable Business, this is multiple sectors. It is reaching out into multiple sectors and understands the need to join up the complexity of what it means to deliver net zero, but in a way that also meets the government's commitments as set out in the 25-year environment plan. Lots to do. None of this is going to be easy. But again, we're working very closely with our sister agencies in the Department of Environment, moving out to other agencies that have responsibility for regulations too, Health Safety Executive, working together so that we can be effective in the way that we regulate.
Thank you, Emma. In the last 3 or 4 minutes then, let me come back to what that challenge is, if you like, and I'll go around all of you, and John, you can answer it in the way you'd like. But Adair, you've been involved in so many commissions on so many things like pensions and low pay. You know how government does and does not work. In a minute, can you summarise what you think the real opportunity is, but where they're really going to have to move much harder and much faster to realise their stated commitments anyway, because you used the word rhetoric about half an hour ago in your opening remarks.
Well, I think there should be two big priorities, one short, one long term. The short term, and it's related to the COVID-19 crisis, is we are going to have a major problem of unemployment because we just can't bring those jobs back fast enough in things like the hospitality sector with social distancing, with people's caution. So job creation is important, and the overlap with the green agenda there is above all buildings, construction, retrofit, improving energy efficiency. We should have a very strong short-term program to create jobs in that area. The long-term one, and this does require clear joined-up thinking, we need to realize how much electricity we will need once we have electrified surface transport, electrified residential heat, started making hydrogen to decarbonize our steel production, our petrochemical processes. We will probably by 2050 need 2.5 times as much electricity as we have today, and we will have to run a complicated system which balances variable supplies of renewable electricity and balances supply and demand. It's all doable, but that requires a long-term vision. You need to build the capacity and the capability steadily year by year. That is one of the most important areas for joined-up thinking, bringing together generation, transmission, distribution, storage, demand management. And that's a real strategic challenge, and government needs to play a major role in setting out how all of that's going to fit together.
Thank you, Adair. Rain, given what you have seen, the extraordinary changes in business in the last 3 months, not least to the struggle to survive, but quickly, literally in a minute if you can, what is the message from you and your Director General, Carolyn Fairbairn, directly to government at the moment? Get on with it.
Absolutely, get on with it. And I'll take one area that we've talked a lot about already, which is about housing. We need to allocate, there was 3.8 billion to allocate.
Rain, I think we've lost you. Emma, we'll come back to you, Rain, if we can, but we've lost the picture. Rain, are you still there? Just finish your sentence. I've seen you mobilize yourself.
Yeah,
You
sorry.
Yeah, seconds,
exactly.
Please.
I think what I will come back to is just what Mark Carney said. Look, the transition to low carbon economy, those companies who do that adjustment will be rewarded handsomely. Those who don't will cease to exist. Making this low carbon transition is existential for business. It's existential for our society. We just have to get on and do it, and we need the policies to deliver that.
All right, get on with it. Emma, quickly, please, if you can. Your 1 minute of message to government at this critical moment when so much is expected.
Well, we're a part of government in the sense that we are a delivery body, and the Environment Agency stands ready to deliver on our net zero commitments. We also have a pension fund which is investing in this way. We also are ready to implement the programme that is being set out from a flooding perspective as well. So the 5.2 billion additional funding over the next 5 years. As we deliver that flood work, we will also be looking at how we do that in a net zero perspective. So we stand ready to work with business and investors to make sure that net zero becomes a reality.
Thank you, Emma. Final word from John. You are chief scientist at the base ministry, and what we've seen remarkably with COVID-19 is an extraordinary new elevation of the voice of science. Scientists listen to. Are you getting that feeling where you are? In other words, that gives us optimism that really science is placing an even greater role now in all of this. Quickly, if you can.
Yes, I agree that science is taken into account. And very quickly, I'd like to say that while technologies are important, they're probably not the determinants in much of this. And I would just like to say, I think the need for the strategic overview is important, but more importantly, the question of pace. We don't have much time to do this.
Yeah.
We don't have much time to do this. I think that's realised by everybody, and it's getting even tighter. John Loughead, Chief Scientist at BASE, thank you very much indeed. Emma Howard-Boyd, Chair of the Environment Agency, Rain Newton-Smith, Chief Economist at the Confederation of British Industry, and Lord Adair Turner, Chair of the Energy Transitions Commission. Thanks for making time this morning to join us to keep pushing and improving the level of momentum that there is. Thanks to all of you for your time this morning. Thank you.